Nothing exploded. No warning sirens. No emergency broadcasts. Yet something heavy shifted off South Africa's coast. Near Cape Town, warships began moving with purpose. Not in isolation, not by coincidence, but together. At first, it looked routine. Vessels entering and leaving Simonstown, radar systems alive, crews rotating through long watches. Then the pattern became impossible to ignore. These were not local patrols. They were Chinese, Russian, and Iranian warships operating alongside South Africa's navy. At the exact moment the United States was seizing Venezuelan oil tankers and tightening pressure far from Africa. This was not a coincidence of schedules. It was placement. While Washington asserted control in the Caribbean, another message was being written at the meeting point of two oceans. No alliance was declared. No threats were issued. Yet the timing, the location, and the choice of partners spoke clearly enough. Something was being tested, quietly, deliberately, and South Africa found itself standing at the center of a shifting global balance. So, what is really going on? Let's find out. Before analysts explained anything, before statements were issued, before officials hid behind careful language, people around Cape Town noticed something simpler and more unsettling. Unusual movement. Warships were coming and going from Simonstown with a rhythm that didn't match routine patrols. Crews worked longer hours. Harbor traffic tightened. Radar and communications activity spiked. Nothing dramatic, which is exactly why it stood out. This was not how joint exercises usually begin. There were no grand welcomes, no televised arrivals, no flags waved for the cameras. Instead, vessels slipped in quietly, as if the priority was not being seen together until they already were. Only later did the identities become clear. Ships from China, Russia, and Iran operating alongside South Africa's navy. The order mattered. Presence came first. Explanation came second. And that order is never accidental. Simonstown is not just another port. It is South Africa's primary naval base, positioned where the Atlantic and Indian Oceans meet, a location naval planners study obsessively because it sits astride routes carrying energy, minerals, and manufactured goods between hemispheres. Any navy operating there knows it is being observed, logged, and remembered. This makes the quiet arrival of multiple sanctioned and rival powers even more deliberate. Then came the timing. As these ships took up positions off South Africa's coast, the United States was escalating pressure on Venezuela, intercepting tankers and asserting control over oil flows thousands of kilometers away. Two different theaters, two different oceans, one unmistakable overlap in intent. While Washington was demonstrating power through seizures and enforcement, these vessels demonstrated something else: coordination without confrontation. No missiles were fired, no exercises were live-streamed. The message was not aggressive, it was structural. It said, we can operate together, far from home, without asking permission. For Iran, this mattered because it shattered the idea that sanctions confined its navy to regional waters. For Russia, it mattered because it reinforced that isolation does not equal immobility. For China, it mattered because leadership is not declared, it is exercised. And for South Africa, the stakes were higher still, because hosting is never passive. Opening a port is an action, not an absence of one. What made this moment especially tense was not what was happening at sea, but what was not happening on land. There was no domestic crisis forcing urgency, no regional conflict demanding a response. This was a decision made in calm conditions, which means it was planned well in advance before headlines caught up. That is why the first real question was never about drills, piracy, or safety. It was about intent. So before anyone asked what these ships were doing, the more important question had already formed, quietly and uncomfortably. Why did these powers choose to show up together, here and now, before anyone could stop them? Because this place was never incidental. Simonstown was chosen precisely because it turns movement into meaning. Any navy that sails here understands the geography instinctively. This is where the Atlantic and Indian Oceans touch, where shipping lanes from Asia, Africa, Europe, and the Americas narrow into something observable and controllable. Energy flows pass nearby. Trade arteries pass nearby. Military planners pass through this location in their war games long before ships ever do in real life. So when Chinese, Russian, and Iranian warships operated from South Africa's primary naval base, they were not just training, they were placing themselves inside a map that matters. Silence was part of the design. There was no early announcement because announcing early invites pressure, protest, and pre-framing by rivals. By the time officials confirmed the drills, the ships were already maneuvering. The facts were already physical. Cameras could argue later, but hulls had already touched water. This tactic, act first, explain later, is common when states want to avoid being boxed in diplomatically before they move. And then there was the global context that made the silence louder. At the same moment these ships assembled in southern Africa, the United States was asserting power in a completely different theater, intercepting Venezuelan oil tankers, escalating enforcement actions, and reminding the world that control over energy routes remains one of Washington's favorite tools. What happened off Cape Town was not a mirror response. It was something more sophisticated. Instead of challenging the US where it was acting, these powers demonstrated freedom of movement somewhere else entirely. This matters because global power today is not just about confrontation. It is about option creation. Showing that pressure in one region does not prevent coordination in another weakens the logic of containment. It suggests that sanctions and seizures create friction, not paralysis. For China, Simonstown offered a chance to practice leadership far from Asian waters, reinforcing its image as a global naval actor rather than a regional one. For Russia, operating here reinforced endurance, the ability to sustain deployments despite diplomatic and economic isolation. For Iran, the location shattered the narrative that its navy is boxed into the Persian Gulf and Strait of Hormuz. And for South Africa, the base itself became the statement. Hosting meant legitimizing presence. Allowing docking, refueling, and coordination is not neutrality in motion. It is neutrality with consequences. Ports are power. Access is leverage. Geography cannot pretend to be passive. This is why Simonstown keeps reappearing in global tension points. In 2023, it was already the subject of US suspicion over alleged Russian weapons transfers. In 2026, it re-emerged not as a scandal, but as a signal. Africa's most industrialized economy is willing to let global rivals operate from its coast. Nothing about this was rushed, which means it was anticipated, including the backlash. And that brings the story forward to the next unavoidable issue. Who actually shaped this operation, and who was merely part of it once it began? The answer is China. Not loudly, not ceremonially, but unmistakably. This operation did not drift into existence through mutual coincidence. It was structured, scheduled, and framed in a way that only one participant was positioned to do. China led the drills, organized them under the BRICS framework, and arrived with the most imposing surface asset in the formation, the 161-meter destroyer Tangshan. That mattered. Leadership at sea is not about issuing press releases. It is about who brings command capability, coordination capacity, and operational confidence. China did all three. But leadership does not mean exclusivity. Russia played a different role, one shaped by its current reality. By sending the Stoichi from its Baltic fleet along with a replenishment tanker, Russia was not showing off power. It was demonstrating persistence. This was about range, logistics, and survivability under pressure. It said, isolation does not stop us from showing up, and sanctions do not erase naval presence. Then there was Iran, whose participation carried a sharper edge. At home, Tehran was facing growing protests and internal strain. Abroad, it is routinely portrayed as regionally confined and diplomatically boxed in. Sailing thousands of kilometers to southern Africa punctured that image. Iran was not there to lead or sustain. It was there to prove reach. Presence itself was the message. Pressure does not equal paralysis. And finally, there was South Africa, whose role is often misunderstood because it involved the least visible hardware. South Africa did not need to dominate the exercise to shape it. By opening Simonstown, its most critical naval base, it provided something far more valuable than firepower: legitimacy. Ports transform ships from visitors into participants. Docking rights turn movement into cooperation. Hosting is never passive, especially when sanctioned states are involved. What tied these roles together was not ideology or friendship, but alignment of interest at a specific moment. China wanted to normalize leadership beyond Asia. Russia wanted to prove endurance. Iran wanted to demonstrate global mobility. South Africa wanted to assert strategic autonomy without formally abandoning non-alignment. The drills satisfied all four aims simultaneously, and that is precisely why this was not declared an alliance. Alliances invite counter-alliances. Treaties demand responses. What happened off Cape Town avoided both. It was coordination without commitment, visibility without provocation, signaling without escalation. Every participant gained something, and none were legally bound beyond the exercise itself. But here is where the story tightens. Because once ships sail together under a shared label, the label itself starts doing political work. Calling this BRICS cooperation was not neutral wording. It was a strategic choice designed to soften perception while sharpening reality. So the next question becomes unavoidable. Why did the name attached to these drills matter almost as much as the ships that carried them out? Let's pause for a second to say, big thank you to the Black Culture Diary community, where Black voices, stories, and legacies are preserved and amplified. By becoming a member, you're not just supporting the channel, you're becoming part of a powerful cultural movement. Let's continue. Because calling it BRICS cooperation changed how the world was forced to respond. The label did not describe the ships, it managed the fallout. BRICS sounds economic, developmental, and bureaucratic. It evokes summits, trade flows, and financial reform, not destroyers and replenishment tankers. By placing these drills under that banner, the organizers wrapped hard military movement in soft institutional language. The result was deliberate ambiguity. Something serious was happening, but no one could easily accuse it of being a formal military alignment. That ambiguity mattered most because of Iran. Iran's 2024 entry into BRICS quietly expanded the bloc's meaning. What had once been framed as a platform for emerging economies now included a heavily sanctioned state regularly portrayed as isolated. Sailing under the BRICS label allowed Iran to appear not as a lone outlier, but as part of a broader, normalized grouping. It did not erase sanctions, it diluted their narrative effect. For China, the label served a different purpose. It allowed Beijing to exercise leadership without declaring dominance. Leading a BRICS drill sounds cooperative rather than commanding, even when China brings the largest ship and sets the operational tempo. This is how influence expands without triggering immediate resistance, not by announcing power, but by embedding it in a multilateral process. Russia benefited in another way. Under a BRICS framework, Russian participation looked routine rather than provocative. This mattered because Russia is already framed in Western discourse as a destabilizing force. The BRICS label blunted that framing, making the drills harder to isolate as a uniquely Russian provocation. And then there was South Africa. For Pretoria, BRICS provided diplomatic insulation. Hosting Russian and Iranian warships directly would have looked like a sharp political choice. Hosting BRICS naval cooperation could be presented as continuity, a follow-up to previous exercises in 2023, a technical engagement rather than a geopolitical declaration. The label allowed South Africa to claim consistency instead of escalation. This is why the name mattered so much. It delayed the confrontation. It is a complicated criticism. It forced opponents to argue not against ships, but against a multilateral framework that already exists and already includes some of the world's largest economies. But labels only work for so long. Once the image is circulated, Russian and Iranian vessels docking at Simonstown, Chinese destroyers maneuvering off Cape Town, the abstraction collapsed into something tangible. At that point, the issue was no longer what the drills were called, but what they represented in practice: sanctioned states operating together from a strategically vital African port. And that is when Washington stopped treating this as a technical exercise and started treating it as a challenge. Which brings the story to its sharpest turn yet. Why did the United States react so strongly to something that was officially framed as routine cooperation rather than confrontation? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. Because neutrality only exists on paper until a port opens its gates. The United States did not react sharply because warships sailed. Navies sail all the time. It reacted because where they sailed exposed a fault line Washington has been watching for years. Simonstown is not a secondary harbor. It is South Africa's primary naval base, tied directly to state authority, military planning, and sovereign decision-making. When Russian and Iranian ships dock there, neutrality stops being an abstract principle and becomes a visible act. For Washington, this touched an already sensitive nerve. President Donald Trump had earlier accused South Africa of supporting bad actors on the world stage, explicitly pointing to its ties with Iran and using that claim to justify cutting U.S. funding. Those accusations had previously relied on interpretation and intent. These drills replaced interpretation with imagery. Photographs of sanctioned warships entering South Africa's most important naval base are far harder to explain away than policy statements. The anger was intensified by memory. In 2023, the U.S. accused South Africa of allowing a sanctioned Russian vessel to dock at Simonstown and load weapons for transfer to Russia's war effort in Ukraine, an allegation Pretoria denied. That dispute never fully disappeared. It merely went quiet. The 2026 drills dragged it back into view, reinforcing Washington's belief that South Africa was drifting from non-alignment towards selective alignment. Inside South Africa, the reaction fractured along political lines. The Democratic Alliance, the second-largest party in the coalition government, openly opposed hosting drills involving Russia and Iran, calling them rogue and sanctioned states. Their argument was not subtle. Labeling the exercise as BRICS cooperation was a political trick designed to soften the reality of deeper military engagement. For them, the risk was not ideological but practical: damage to trade relations, diplomatic retaliation, and long-term reputational cost. The government pushed back by repeating a familiar line: South Africa follows a non-aligned foreign policy and does not take sides. But non-alignment in a polarized world is increasingly judged not by words, but by access. Who is allowed to dock? Who is allowed to refuel? Who is allowed to train? From Washington's perspective, the concern went beyond South Africa itself. If Africa's most industrialized economy can openly host sanctioned powers without immediate consequence, then the architecture of isolation starts to weaken. Sanctions rely on the denial of access. Ports like Simonstown undermine that logic quietly but decisively. This is why the U.S. reaction was not just diplomatic irritation, it was strategic discomfort. The drills suggested that pressure campaigns no longer guarantee compliance, and that alternative networks are not theoretical but operational. By the time official protests were voiced, the damage or the shift, depending on perspective, was already done. The ships had sailed. The precedent had been set. And the question Washington now had to confront was no longer about South Africa's intentions, but about the limits of its own leverage. Which leads to the final question that hangs over this entire episode. What did these drills actually change in the balance of power, beyond anger, accusations, and headlines? What it changed was not the balance of power overnight, but the rules of behavior beneath it. These drills did not announce a new alliance, redraw borders, or threaten immediate conflict. They did something far more durable. They normalized behavior that was previously treated as exceptional. Sanctioned states operating together, openly, from a strategically critical African port, without hiding, apologizing, or backing down, is no longer theoretical. It has now happened. For China, the change was subtle but significant. Beijing demonstrated that its leadership is no longer confined to economics or Asia. Organizing and leading a naval exercise at the southern tip of Africa, it showed that Chinese influence now extends into spaces traditionally shaped by Western naval dominance. Not through confrontation, but through coordination. Not through declarations, but through logistics and presence. For Russia, the shift was psychological. Isolation is only effective if it limits movement. Sailing from the Baltic to southern Africa and operating alongside multiple partners signaled that sanctions complicate operations but do not end them. Russia did not need to dominate the drill. It needed to be there. And it was. For Iran, the change was narrative-breaking. Iran is routinely described as boxed in, regionally constrained, and diplomatically cornered. Operating off South Africa's coast shattered that image. It showed that Iran's naval reach is not symbolic, and that internal pressure does not automatically translate into external paralysis. For South Africa, the consequences are the most complex. By hosting, Pretoria exercised sovereignty in its purest form, deciding who may enter its ports and under what conditions. But sovereignty exercised in this way always reshapes expectations. South Africa has now demonstrated that non-alignment does not mean non-engagement, and that Western approval is not a prerequisite for military cooperation on African soil. That realization will linger long after the ships depart. Globally, the drill weakened a key assumption behind modern pressure campaigns: that access can be denied indefinitely. Ports, bases, and logistical corridors are the quiet foundations of power. When they remain open to sanctioned states, sanctions lose part of their bite, not instantly, but structurally. This is why the drill mattered even without confrontation. It rehearsed a world where power circulates through multiple hubs instead of flowing from one center. A world where cooperation does not require ideological unity, only overlapping interests. A world where Africa is not just a stage, but a decision maker. Nothing dramatic happened at sea, and that is precisely the point. The most important shifts rarely announce themselves with explosions. They happen when something once controversial becomes routine. The ships will leave Simonstown, the statements will fade, but the permission that was exercised and observed will not be forgotten. So the real question now is not whether this drill changed the world, but how many more times this kind of routine cooperation must happen before it stops feeling unusual at all. Let us know in the comments section what the US is going to do about it. Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.